My name's I'm one of the event hosts here at RJ Julia, and I wanted to welcome you here for Amy Chua's debut crime novel, Golden Gate. So afterwards, we do have a few of the books for sale, and we'll have Amy available to sign books. If we run out of books, we have book plates. So we will sell you the book, and she can sign the book plate, and then you can put it in when the book comes in. Oh, so we have plenty of books. So Amy Chua is the John M. Duff Jr. Professor of Law at Yale Law School. She's an internationally best-selling author of several nonfiction titles, including her memoir, Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother, an international bestseller that has been translated into more than 30 languages. She is a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School. She joined the Yale Law School faculty in 2001. A noted expert in the areas of foreign policy, globalization, and ethnic conflict, Chua is a multiple-time recipient of the Yale Law School's Best Teaching Award. She recently celebrated her birthday by being honored with the 2023, I'm going to try to pronounce this correctly, Lux et Veritas Faculty Prize by the Buckley Institute for her efforts to foster intellectual diversity among her students in and out of the classroom. She lives in New Haven and New York City with her husband and her unbelievably cute dogs, and her two daughters are her pride and joy. The Golden Gate is her fiction debut. Welcome, Amy.
Thanks so much for that great introduction, and thank you all for coming tonight. It is such a pleasure to be back here at RJ Julia, which is, I think, my favorite bookstore in the world. We have a lot of history. As Pam mentioned, this is my first novel, so while it's a very exciting new stage in my life, it's also something that makes me very nervous. So I'm especially appreciative that you all came out to support me tonight. So I'm excited to tell you about The Golden Gate and how I came to write it and what I was hoping to do. But first, I thought that before that, I would take just 10 minutes to tell you about my larger personal and professional journey. Because it's actually relevant to the novel. So, you know, how I went from a shy Asian kid to a Yale law professor and the author of some conversation-starting books, and now this first-time novelist. And as I was thinking about it, what the answer is, like, how did I end up here? I realized that at one level, the answer is by learning over many, many years, through a lot of mistakes, how to turn being an outsider, which I've always felt and still feel to this day, how to turn that sense of being an outsider from a disadvantage into a source of strength. And I recently realized that every single one of my books, from my foreign policy books, World on Fire, where I coined this term market dominant minorities, to the notorious Tiger Mom book, to this novel, every single one of the books I've written actually reflects, and I think in some ways benefits from an outsider's perspective. So that's one answer. I think at another level, the answer to how I ended up where I am today, and I think this is the more honest answer, is basically through a series of colossal disasters and failures and the most humiliating rejections that at the time I thought I would never recover from. I am the firmest believer in what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And I feel that I'm constantly tested. But I really do feel that that everything has a silver lining. I'm always telling my students that I really believe that what feels like the worst thing ever, something that makes you like not even think you could survive another day, always ends up being like the best thing ever. Sometimes it takes years before you realize why. So anyway, starting from the beginning, I grew up as the eldest daughter of super strict Chinese immigrant parents, the original Tiger parents. I wrote that book. It was somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but I was born in the United States. my parents applied that method to me with no humor. And the result was my three younger sisters and I, we weren't really allowed to do very many fun things. And not a lot of wild socializing, certainly. So maybe like many of you, my favorite pastime, really only pastime, was reading. I was a huge bookworm. And my best memories from childhood, all the way even through like junior high, was going to the public library with my sister about half a mile away, and then coming back with my books, my arms just overloaded with books. And all of those books would be mystery books. When I was really little, like, I read every single Nancy Drew book, and then I graduated, read every single Agatha Christie book. And I think a lot of the students are too young to know these days, but Dorothy Eden, Victoria Holt, Daphne du Maurier, I read all of those things. Anyway, I spent the first 7 years of my life in Indiana, and then we moved to the Bay Area when I was 7. And I grew up in a modest town called El Cerrito, which is kind of like a not nice satellite of Berkeley, a less nice satellite of Berkeley, California. I attended a huge public high school, El Cerrito High School, where 90% of the school was non-college bound. And El Cerrito is where the protagonist of my book, Detective Al Sullivan, is also from. More on him later. So I went back east for college, and I went to Harvard, and it was fun. It was my first taste of freedom, so that was fun. But it was also difficult in many ways. I think most of you are East Coasters, but there is a real cultural difference. Coming from El Cerrito, the Bay Area, I could tell the difference just looking at people. I could tell the difference between a Vietnamese American, from a Korean American, for a Japanese American, for Chinese American, Laotian. Even within the Chinese, I could tell first generation, second generation, third. But when I got to Harvard, I did not know what a WASP was. I had never heard of that term. Believe it or not, I didn't know what a Jewish person was. It was only later on that I realized, oh, somebody's name who was Daniel Roser, that must have been, I didn't know those things. But the hardest thing about me being in college is that as the eldest child in this strict immigrant family, I did everything that my parents wanted me to do. I'm not even sure that I knew what I wanted to do, but I don't think it's the case anymore, hopefully. But my parents, for that generation, they just stereotypically wanted me to be a scientist. MD, PhD, they wanted me to be a doctor. So at Harvard, I majored in applied math. I was pre-med. It's so stupid that I did that, right? I'm terrible at math, hate math, and I faint at the sight of veins and blood. I could not be a doctor. And interestingly, all of my favorite classes, and I felt that I was lying and hiding this from my parents, were English or literature classes. Those are the things I really liked. But it was out of the question that I could major in that. And so I switched to economics, not as my major, not because I was in any way interested in it, but because I thought I could persuade my parents that economics was sort of like a science. I applied to law school solely to not have to go to medical school. And I remember when I told my parents, my mom, that I was going to Harvard Law School, she burst into tears. At that generation, my parents came from a country, China, then the Philippines, where lawyers were absolutely not respected. So anyway, when I went to law school, I actually had a very, very rough time. It's very hard to imagine now. The demographics in this country are so different. I'm very proud that we have lots of Asian Americans at the Yale Law School now, many of them here tonight. But when I was at Harvard, I was the only Asian in my entire section of 150. Wow. Worse, law just did not come naturally to me. Because of the way I was raised, I was not good at critical thinking. So I was raised in kind of Confucian values, like really always respect your elders, just defer to authority. So I was incredibly good. I just wanted to listen to the teacher and memorize everything the person said. And I was really good at that. And that formula worked really well in high school and in college. But then I got to law school, and I still remember Philip Arita in my big contracts class. He's the guy that the monstrous, the scary guy in Paper Chase is based on. He called on me, and it was like, Miss Chua, this opinion, do you agree or disagree with it? And I literally just had no thoughts, total blank in my head. I remember thinking at the time, a judge wrote it. It must be right. And I didn't have my own philosophical or normative views, or I didn't have my own political views. It was just kind of the way that I was raised. So law school is not easy for me, but I will give a plug for Tiger parenting values. There is so much to be said for just like hard work and not giving up and perseverance. So I was never particularly talented and by no means close to being among the smarter people in the class, but I did fine by just working 10 times harder than everybody else. So after graduating, I went to Washington, D.C., where I clerked for Chief Judge Patricia Wald of the D.C. Circuit. And she was amazing. She was a civil rights pathbreaker. She was the first woman chief judge of the DC Circuit. There's a huge portrait of her at Yale Law School. 4'11", absolutely terrifying. And but she was a mentor in the old school way, as in not at all nice or supportive, just tough love all the way. And even in the interview with her, I remember she grim-faced handed me back my resume, the first thing that I submitted, with a big X. She had found a typo. And every memo came back, completely marked up. Anyway, I stumbled my way through that year. And at the end of the year, we had our exit interview. This is a tradition where she meets with each of her 3 clerks separately and kind of gives them life advice. So she got to my turn and she asked me what I was going to do. And reflexively, unthinkingly, I just said I was going to be a law professor. I had always said this because my father's a professor. They all, it's kind of I thought that should be what I did, but I had no idea how that was going to happen or what specialty or what. And she just straightened me out. I remember she said, "Oh my God, you can't possibly do that." She said, "You don't know anything. What could you possibly teach?" And then she said, "You need to go out into the real world and figure out who you are. You need at least 3 years of experience, preferably 5." And she said, and it can be anything: public interest, government work, private sector. So I took her advice and I joined the Wall Street firm of Cleary, Gottlieb, Steen and Hamilton.
wow.
It's a big firm that specializes in international transactions. And I stayed there for 3 years, and I have a bunch of students here. They know that I'm still close to the firm. I bring a lot of my former colleagues to be my guest lecturers. But the entire 3 years I was there, I knew I had massive imposter syndrome. I absolutely knew I couldn't stay. Even just riding up the elevator the first day with an empty briefcase. And I just wasn't interested in it, and I wasn't talented at it. So I actually fell into a pretty big depression slump. I was like, what am I doing with my life? Why did I go to law school? And I'm stuck. What am I going to do? And it was then that I tried to write my first novel. I still remember like sneaking off at lunchtime, trying to find time, even while I was at this firm. And I wanted it to be a mother-daughter Chinese immigrant intergenerational story. But at the time, I had not realized how important it is to have a plot. So it didn't work out. And I still remember when Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan came out. Right around then, I was just so jealous because it was exactly what I was trying to do. Anyway, then I got incredibly lucky. I found my own weird little niche in the law and kind of the source of all the books that I've written almost completely by accident. So here's what happened. At this firm I was at, Cleary Gottlieb, the special thing about this firm is it represented governments. So if you look at Wall Street law firms, they often represent investment banks or insurance companies, corporations, but Cleary specialized in representing sovereigns. So the government of Ecuador, the government of Venezuela, the government of Ivory Coast, of Jamaica, Russia, actually. And I like that because I'd always been interested in developing countries. My parents are from a developing country, so that's kind of what interested me. But shortly after I got there, I was put on a deal, the privatization of Mexico's national telephone company, Telmex, Telefones de Mexico. And so we represented the Mexican government, and privatization just means at the time the state-owned, the telephone company was state-owned and completely not functioning. You could not get a dial tone, nothing worked. So this is like in the 90s. And they wanted to sell it to somebody who had capital and who could modernize it and who could inject capital into it. And we actually sold it to Carlos Slim, turning him into the richest man in the world overnight. But there was also a securities IPO component to it. So I was given, as the lowest person on the totem pole, I was given the task of writing up the history of Mexico's economy. It was so unimportant. It wasn't even for the securities prospectus. It was for the appendix. But I loved it. It was the first thing at this law firm that I loved because I love history. And again, the Golden Gate is completely its history. So I got really into it. I poured myself into it. And I discovered something. I discovered a pattern that for all of Mexico's entire 200-year history, the country kept oscillating back and forth between very pro-free market, pro foreign investor, pro-capital periods. Then it would swing to very revolutionary, nationalizing, anti-imperial, anti-capitalist, anti-American periods. Then it would swing back to very open, pro-capital, pro-private sector. So I was so excited about this. I wrote this whole thing up. And I remember taking it into the partner, thinking finally I'd done a really good job on something. And he looks at this thing and he said, "Oh my God, this is awful. Do you not understand what we're trying to do? We are trying to sell stock. All this stuff about anti-foreigner confiscation and xenophobic backlash. Who is going to buy the stock?" And he was like, "It has to be completely accurate, but it doesn't have to sound this bad." And then he said, "And besides, I asked you for 3 paragraphs, not a dissertation." So I slunk off and I redid it, made it sound better. But then I had this 35-page document that I didn't want to waste. And at this point, I had been at this law firm for almost 3 years. And I thought, okay, now is the time to take Judge Wald's suggestion. I'm going to go on the academic teaching market. I'm going to try to apply to be a professor. So I turned this article into a draft article, this thing. I called it the privatization nationalization cycle in developing countries. And I wrote a cover letter, and I stapled this draft article and I applied to 100 law schools across the country for teaching jobs. And I got 100 rejections. I kid you not. 8 of them after full day interviews, which is excruciatingly painful because it's just so on the merits. And one of the places that I got rejected was from the Yale Law School. And this was particularly humiliating because my husband had just been hired by Yale Law School about 3 years earlier. And he was this constitutional law superstar, golden boy. So I was basically being interviewed and rejected by the same people we were socializing with. But as I said, I really believe that there's a silver lining to everything. So here's what happened. The way you get a teaching job, at least at Yale, is you have to clear 2 stages. First, you have to make it through a screening interview with the all-powerful appointments committee. This is a committee appointed by the dean, like 8 people. And you go to lunch with these people and you try to impress them. And if you clear that, do you get to go to the full faculty and present your paper to the faculty. Okay, so I flunked the screening stage. But I have PTSD, it was at Maury's, and I still remember the room. And so it was the screening interview was a colossal, unmitigated disaster from beginning to end. It was 8 men, very, very smart. Nothing was wrong with them. I didn't know how to talk like an academic. I've been on Wall Street. My family we didn't do philosophy. And it was a nightmare. They kept asking me what my thesis was. And I was stumped because I thought I'd already told them. But they kept asking me. So I was just, at some point I was just going to leave. And one thing I had noticed when I was down in Mexico, just something I observed, I guess this is the kind of stuff I'm interested in. I had noticed that all the people that we were working with down in Mexico City, basically the elites, so the Mexican government officials, the Mexican investment bankers, all the CEOs in Mexico were taller, lighter skinned with more European features. Many of them had blonde hair and blue eyes, And whereas the great majority of the Mexican people, all the people doing the menial labor, all the people on the streets, all the people doing the Xeroxing were shorter, darker with indigenous features. And I had actually worked this into this draft article. But in this screening interview, I was so embarrassingly inarticulate. Now I know how to say, oh, pigmentocratic structures, but at the time, it was just ridiculous stuff coming out of my mouth trying to explain this. Rich people look kind of white to me, and it was so hopeless that the dean at the time, Guido, tried to save me by interjecting and talking about Italian influences on New Haven architecture. So anyway, at a certain point, I thought, I've been here 2 hours and it's just getting worse and worse. I'm still working at Clear. I'm just going to get back on a train and go back to New York City, cut my losses. And right before I did that, my colleague now, Professor John Langbein, a brilliant legal historian, stopped me and said, oh, I get it now. I think I know now what it is you're interested in. You are interested in the link between markets and ethnicity. And I was like, yes, I had never thought of what I was writing in these terms. Like I literally thought I was writing about telephones, but as I thought about it, he was just smarter. He was right. That was the phenomenon that I was kind of starting to be circulating around. So anyway, I got rejected. Faster than anybody. But here's the silver lining. As soon as I got back to New York City, the first thing I did is I pulled up my draft article and I added a subtitle. The article was now called The Privatization Nationalization Cycle, the link between markets and ethnicity in developing countries. And I reworked the whole thing, putting this framework in. It sounded so much more sophisticated. So back on to that 100 rejections, I was telling you my father, they're still 87, my parents doing well, the original Tiger parents. I remember calling him actually in tears, saying, Dad, I hate to disappoint you. I know you always wanted me to be a professor, since I wasn't a doctor, but I have to tell you, it's just not going to happen. Nobody wants me, I've been rejected by everyone. And I will never forget my father's response. He's like, let me understand this, Amy. You have been rejected by 100 law schools and you want to give up? He thought that was a low number. But my parents came to this country knowing not one person. My mother could barely speak the language. They were so poor the first 2 winters in Boston, they wore blankets around because they couldn't afford heat. So to him, being whining about 100 rejections, so I took his advice and I applied to a few more schools that still hadn't rejected me, and I got an offer. I got one offer. The University of Buffalo Law School gave me an offer. I was ecstatic, and I will always love Buffalo. I still to this day root for all of their sports teams because they are the only one that would take a chance on me. So I was going to move there, we were going to commute, and then at the last second, the Duke Law School, which had actually already rejected me, unrejected me very openly. They're like, somebody else we like better canceled. So I went to Duke, and there I continued doing my own weird stuff. If you go to law school, most professors write about corporations or contracts law or constitutional law or criminal law. But I was interested in my own, the relationship between market and democratic reforms and ethnic conflict and, religious structures. And in 2000, I wrote a second article. It was called Markets, Democracy, and Ethnicity. And the Yale Law Journal took it. And then I got really lucky timing-wise in a tragic way. That is, the attacks on the World Trade Center happened. This is September 11th, 2001. And suddenly, before my article was like this obscure thing about law and development. Nobody cared about it. But suddenly after 9/11, everybody in the country, in the world, was interested in exactly what I was writing about, which is the dangers of rapid democratization in non-Western countries and ethnic conflict and globalization. So through my colleague Akil Mar, he said there's an agent that's interested. Anyway, I ended up turning the article into my first book, It was published by Doubleday, and it did very well. Actually, I spoke here at RJ Julie about it, and it was a New York Times bestseller for 1 day. But that's all. Melta, it's all it takes to be officially a New York Times bestseller, and then to get the best real estate in the bookstores. And after 7 years after Yale rejected me, I, on the basis of that book, got hired, and I've been there since 2001. I could tell you one story that I'm going to tell you about the Golden Gate. The first semester I got there, I taught this class, International Business Transactions. I was so scared. I was convinced that all my students with all their PhDs and Rhodes Scholars and all this stuff were actually smarter than me. And so I was just so terrified, but I made it through. And then in April of the first semester that I was a professor there, I swear this happened. Okay, this has really happened. I get a call from the public relations office, and they're like, "Amy, where are you? Everybody's waiting for you." I was like, "What?" I had forgotten it was the annual faculty photo. So for like 200 years, Yale does this every year. There's an annual faculty photo where the entire faculty goes out in the courtyard and they line up, and you could see these photos from like 300 years. And I had completely forgotten about it. So I was like, "Oh no," it's like, I'm the least important person. Everyone's waiting for me. So I dashed out, my office. I ran down the hall, sprinted down the stairs. I burst into the courtyard. And there at the very end of the courtyard, I see my entire faculty, like 40 people lined up at the very end, probably 90% men. This photographer looking at his watch, looking annoyed. And then Guido sees me and he's like, "Amy, there you are. Hurry up." So I'm like, "Coming," and everybody's like, "Yummy." And I start running towards the faculty in my heels, trying to look as elegant as I could. And I was about 15 feet away from them, and I tripped. Okay, I lost my balance, and I tripped once, twice. I tried to regain my balance, but I couldn't. And I went sprawling in front of everybody. Total face plant in front of everybody. And people remember this, okay? So it's verifiable. And I still remember lying there on the ground and thinking, saying to myself, "Amy, I don't think you can recover from this one." I actually thought about getting up and just running away. Change up. So anyway, so that was 2003. In 2011, I wrote a very different book. It was a memoir. That book is so misunderstood, like as is. Well, that's a story about life, but it was not a how-to guide. I actually wrote it when my younger daughter Lulu rebelled at the age of 13, and my younger sister got leukemia. So it's actually a much more textured book. Now that book was still nonfiction, but it was different. It was mostly storytelling. If you go look at that book now, you'll see it's made of 35 chapters. Each one is a short little chapter. It's a little story. And it had a voice, which a lot of people hated and found very annoying. It had characters. If you read the book correctly, you will see that my two daughters are the protagonists, and I am the villain. And it had drama, and it had an arc and a crisis and a revolution. And that book was much easier for me to write. I have chronic writer's block. My first book, World on Fire, took me 7 years. I just cranking out one sentence a day, staring at the screen. I wrote the first 2/3 of Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother in 3 months. It just poured out. So that was the transition. And this brings me finally to the Golden Gate, which honestly is the most fun thing I've ever done professionally. So the idea for this plot, I told you my first time I didn't have a plot, but this one just hit me. I was in my parents' house about 3.5 years ago. This is in Berkeley, and it just came to me. And I'm not going to give it away because I think it's very clever. But the structure of it is the grandmother from one of San Francisco's most established, wealthiest WASP families is told by the DA on the first page that one of her 3 granddaughters is a murderer, but they don't know which one for reasons that and with a huge twist at the end, which I'm not going to tell you. But I saw it all the way to the end. I knew what the ending was. And then I had to have setting. So part of the inspiration for this book has to do with an amazing total coincidence. My parents currently live in Berkeley, California, So I grew up in El Cerrito, but they were kind of the American dream. I grew up in a really not nice house. But once I went to college, they moved up into the Berkeley Hills. It's on the cover. This is the Claremont Hotel. They live a few blocks away from that. That's like their view. But my parents, who are 87 years old right now, currently live in Madame Chiang Kai-shek's former house for reasons no one to this day knows. And I've read every biography about her, even historians. Madame Chiang Kai-shek lived by herself in Berkeley, California from 1943 to 1944. What was the First Lady of China doing in Berkeley, California, in the middle of the Second World War? And at the time, there were rumors. The official explanation was because of a dermatologist. But at the time, there were rumors circulating that she was having an affair with a presidential candidate, Wendell Willkie, who is the founder of Willkie Farr and came in, almost beat FDR in an earlier presidential election. As it happens, Wendell Willkie died in 1944, the year that my book is set. So I basically spun a whole story out of these actual, real, mysterious historical facts. Also, as I mentioned, my parents lived just down the street from the Claremont Hotel, and there is a real life ghost story associated with that hotel. In the 1930s, a 7-year-old girl was found dead in the laundry chute. And it is said that ever since then, her spirit haunts the hotel still, specifically the 4th floor and specifically room 422. And I was just out at Portland giving a talk at Howell's, and a woman in the audience said, I have stayed at the Claremont Hotel. It is definitely haunted. The ghost exists. And so I built that into the book as well. So the book opens, there's an opening scene where this DA, I am a lawyer, district attorney, informs this grandmother from one of San Francisco's most established families that one of her 3 granddaughters is a murderer, but they don't know which. Then we flash back immediately to 1930, 14 years earlier, where a little girl is found dead in the Claremont Hotel in a laundry chute. And then we flip back to 14 years later, where we meet, where also at the Claremont Hotel, a presidential candidate based on Wendell Willkie is murdered. And somehow these two links, 14 years, these two murders, 14 years apart, are related. And it's for our protagonist, Detective Al Sullivan, to figure out how. So in terms of what I was trying to do with this book, I have always loved these classic hard-boiled 1920s and 30s, detective stories from like the golden age. Like, again, I have some young people here who ever heard like Dashiell Hammett, Sam Spade, and Philip Marlowe, and this is like a Humphrey Bogart characters. But I wanted to update that because obviously it is so dated. They're all, tough guy men. So when you meet Detective Al Sullivan, at first he seems just like that, like this tough guy, noir detective person. But we quickly learned that his mother is from the Dust Bowl, dirt poor Oklahoma, Okie. And on his father's side, he is half Mexican and half Jewish. And Sullivan can pass as white. And in fact, his real name is Alejo Gutierrez, but he chooses to go by his mother's last name, Al Sullivan, instead for reasons he doesn't quite admit to himself. So underneath this classic tough guy exterior is a lot of insecurity and ambivalence and a lot of secrets. So I chose to make my protagonist, Detective Sullivan, a light-skinned mixed-race man. Well, actually, at first I wanted to make my detective an Asian American woman, but I was not able to do that because there were 0 women or minorities on the Berkeley PD in 1944. This is the they were interned. This is the time of the Japanese internment. There were no, that was so anachronistic, it was impossible. So that was one reason, but I chose to make him a white passing light-skinned man. Because I have always, this goes back to the work I did with Telmex and all these articles and pigmentocracy. I've always been interested in racial passing and what my former colleague Kenji Yoshino calls covering, or I think in young people's terms, code switching. And this is it's just something that I'm so personally familiar with. And it's basically people from kind of outside or marginalized groups, not quite mainstream, feeling that they need to suppress some aspects of their identity because they think that's what it takes to rise in American society. And it could be accent, it could be your last name, it could be the way you dress or whatever. It could be your gender identification. So Detective Sullivan is very perceptive, and he's obsessed with the way that wealthy people fold their legs or dress. And he has 2 shirts. He has no money. He has 2 shirts, but they're super expensive. And he washes them every night. He presses them. And there are other characters based on historical real figures in my book that I really love. So one person is Dr. Margaret Mom Chung. I cannot believe that growing up in Berkeley, I didn't know about her. She was the first Chinese-American pediatrician, doctor, first Chinese-American physician in the United States. And you could not make this person up. There's actually a couple books about her. She was a larger than life figure. So at a time when there was so much discrimination, her patients included Ronald Reagan, John Wayne. She took out Mary Pickford's tonsils. And then she had a clinic in San Francisco. And on weekends, she would have these soirees, 60 people at a time at her house, where she would have these Air Force pilots or Army pilots come and mix with these Hollywood celebrities. And she was this huge figure, so much so that when she died, one of her pallbearers was Admiral Nimitz, and another one was the mayor of San Francisco. Anyway, she was this amazing person, but it's clear that almost certainly was lesbian. She dressed in men's clothes. She called herself Mike, and attended bohemian social clubs. But you know, it was just not possible, I think, for her to identify as such. And another person, just very quickly, Julia Morgan, maybe the most famous woman architect in the United States. She designed the Hearst Castle. Before that, she actually designed the Campanile. That was the only one that survived the San Francisco earthquake. And that's why Hearst wanted her to build his Hearst Castle. But again, very funny coincidence. She was a bit like Dr. Mom Chung. She also coincidentally dressed in men's clothing, never married, and you know, so again, probably hit. Okay, I'm almost done. One more thing that okay. The last thing I really want to do, and I'll end with this, is I really was obsessed with the history of this period. I realize that when you live in a place, you can be more ignorant about it, you know, because like when you go to Paris, then you take the tours. I did not realize that I saw these signs, but after Pearl Harbor, what happened was the Japanese basically took out the US Navy in Pearl Harbor, but then we still had the Pacific theaters, and almost overnight, the San Francisco Bay Area became the largest shipbuilding center in the history of the world. It would have taken too long to build these ships back in, you know, on the East Coast and then move them. So San Francisco was like a sleepy little town before that. Overnight, they used Henry Ford's new assembly line techniques that they used to make cars. And they were basically churning out a ship every 3 days. And because there were so much industry and so much jobs, this is when everybody poured in. And it's at this time that African Americans came to the San Francisco Bay Area for the first time. I did not know that. They came by train, immigrants from everywhere. And the result is that this gave rise to ethnic, racial, and class conflicts that are so parallel to what we have today. You know, there was the Japanese internment 14 years before. Up to 1 million Mexicans have been forcibly deported back. I did not know that either. And there were racial covenants. Anyway, above all, that was all backdrop, because above all, I didn't want this to be political. I wanted it to be a great whodunit, you know, a thriller that keeps you guessing. And I will say that so far, no one has figured out the mystery. No one has guessed the ending.
So with the challenge.
So with that tantalizing challenge, I'm having to take questions. And thank you guys again for coming.
So we'll take about, unfortunately, only about 3 questions, because we want to get to the signing line, and I have a feeling that you know some of these people, and so they're gonna want pictures taken and stuff. I also wanted to say is that I just spoke to somebody who read the book, and he gobbled it up like in 2 days. So it's very much a page turner. It's already getting some great reviews. Questions? Oh, we're gonna get right to. Oh, here we go, right here.
Hi, Professor Chua. Love the book. There's an incredible wealth of detail in the story. and these multiple interweaving, highly intricate plot lines that take place amongst all the different characters, amongst these two different periods in time that we're looking at, amongst different geographies, San Francisco, the East Bay wine country. Like to the degree that there are like hundreds of them, perhaps, that like all kind of lead into figuring out the final answer to the puzzle. I would love insight into what your process was like in one, kind of like creating so much detail, two, managing it, and then three, imagining ways in which it could all lead to the ultimate answer that we uncover at the end.
Did you hear the question back there?
Oh, I can repeat it. He was saying that there's so much historical detail and there are these like intricate plot lines and red herrings. And what was the process that I used to kind of put it all together, and to kind of bring it all together. And I love that question because it actually, a lot of people say, what are you doing? You're a lawyer. What is going on? But it's this part of it is actually a very similar skill. To write a historical thriller, especially a historical one. So the research is very similar. I will say that historical research can be like an excuse for procrastination. And I'm sure my students will know what I'm talking about. It's like, I can't start writing, I'm still researching, now I have to put that as on index cards because I'm just putting off the process. But the part that's like being a lawyer is when you write a historical thriller, it can't be a cheap shot. Like when you get to the end, the killer can't be somebody that just walked off the street that no one ever heard of, right? Everyone will feel like so you have to, there's a timeline and you have to put false leads in a way that doesn't give it away, but at the end, people think it's fair. So it's actually quite like legal analysis in some ways. Like there's a kind of intricacy and a logic and analysis that you have to figure out. And it's hard, like, the timing and little things, like it's like putting together a murder criminal law, because like if the timing is wrong, oh my God, I found these horrible errors, like, a person that should have been dead was talking, then I just switch it. Yeah, but thank you.
That's an excellent answer. So it's not somebody who just walked in off the street.
Yeah.
Another question?
I'm sure.
It's been a very thorough talk.
Yes.
Yeah, there and then last question.
Question about what your parents thought about your writing novels. Given their
one thing that I've learned even with myself is that, I remember thinking that my parents, when I was growing up, that they were so old, and so they were like 35, half my age. And so people do change. My parents changed very, very quickly. By the time there were all these rigidities. When my mother was little, all the books she liked were novels too. It was just kind of this weird thing. And it wasn't just being mean. If you're an immigrant, whether it's from China or another country, language barrier is a huge thing. So of course they couldn't imagine majoring in English. They couldn't even speak English, So science and numbers is like a natural thing that immigrants fall to, whether you're a Jewish immigrant or from Latin America. But by the time I did this, they were very excited about it, but they didn't think I could do it.
Okay, great. Now last question right here.
Are you working on a new book?
Yes, so I have not given up nonfiction. I'm just giving it a rest. I mean, my previous book before this, I actually spoke here, is on political tribalism and the polarization in America. And I have to tell you, it is so much more fun and uplifting to write about murder. The worst. So I do have a sequel, and they're interested in a sequel. I'm interested in the period right after this. Not so much McCarthyism, but okay, all I'll say is I'm going to move myself down to Beverly Hills because I'm very interested in Beverly Hills, and the history there is the racial, and it's so interesting. And I am introducing Borges. I'm very interested in him. He's going to play a role. That's okay. I don't have a full plot yet.
That sounds great. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming.